started. Last time I did a general review of how we got here and then Perek Dalet. And that was all about him building the wall and how he's planning everything. Takes a digression. Chapter 5 is a major digression from his construction of the city of Yerushalayim. He feels he has to tackle an important problem, and we'll see what the problem is. And we'll have some people taking turns reading it, whoever wants to. Whenever I have no choice, I have my wife. We're going to read the English of the first. I divided the parak up into 5 parts. Want to read? Anyone? Okay, yeah, I can always count on her.
Pasuk 1.
Right.
There was a great outcry by the common folk and their wives against their brother Jews. Some said, "Our sons and daughters are numerous. We must get grain to eat in order that we may live." Others said, "We must pawn our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain to stave off hunger." Yet others said, "We have borrowed money against our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now, Alit," what does that mean?
No, that wasn't sure about, as was pointed out by Adar up front, it's an unusual choice of language, so they have difficulty making a translation. So that's why our flesh is as good as the flesh of. It's a very strange phrase that he's saying the people are using.
Okay. Our flesh is as good as the flesh of. We are as good as our brothers.
So he translated in more colloquial terms.
We are as good as our brothers, and our children as good as theirs. Yet here we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters are already subjected, and we are powerless, while our fields and vineyards belong to others.
Okay.
Looks like Biden was.
What?
Looks like Biden was in Israel. Yeah.
Okay.
Inflation.
It doesn't say anything about inflation. Not what it is. Okay. So who is complaining here?
Everyone.
Okay, but who do they specifically mention? But who's the other person they mentioned? Wives. Women are complaining. It's not just the men getting up and talking, the women articulating what the challenges are. And in this particular case, the woman would have been somewhat separated from the husbands because the husbands were working in Yerushalayim to build the walls. So here you have the wives back with the fields. They don't even own the fields, and they're trying to figure out how am I going to feed the children. So they spoke up in addition because they had a unique perspective on that. And who are they speaking to? Well, actually says El Achehem HaYehudim. Before Nechamia steps up, they're crying and attacking the leadership or the wealthier people in the community and saying, so this is not directed specifically to Nechamia. Nechamia, if you read the first sentence of the second paragraph, just read it. It angered me. It angered me very much to hear their outcry and these complaints. So he heard it, but they didn't bring it to him. They were complaining in general, and the word was out that they were struggling.
Okay. It says to pay the king's tax. Is that Cyrus's tax?
No. Okay. Well, it's the king's tax. It doesn't matter who the king is. At this time, Cyrus is dead and buried.
Okay, so it's Darius.
Yeah. But now we've gone through Ahasuerus. Yeah, but it's just a standard tax. I mean, it's a tax on property that existed throughout this period. Wasn't anything special that he did, right?
Could I ask you,
Sure.
when was this period of Nechamia take place?
Okay, so Nechamia, okay, so the temple was destroyed in 587. The Jews arrived back in around 515. So Nechamia would have been about 480 BCE.
So it's before the second.
No, it was already built.
This was, the first temple was destroyed.
They already built the second temple in 515.
Okay,
And Nechamia arrives after that was built.
yeah.
It was probably not much more impressive than this room. Second base of English when they built it. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any architects. Yeah, so it was not an impressive site. Nobody ever talks about how impressive it was. Yeah, when Herod is king, they say, wow, what did Chazal was saying, what a wonderful place. But it wasn't in this time.
This
Just
is before Herod.
long before it's 400. Herod is, and Jesus were about, well, Herod was just before the period of Jesus. The decades before the Common Era started. Okay. Yeah, and Herod, was mixed lineage, and he built an amazing palace, and he got credit for it. But here, we have no idea, we have no remnants. We have remnants of the city walls that Nechamia built. There's a famous wall when you go on these tours, they call it Nechemia's wall. Okay, because Nechamia was known for having built the walls of the city. But Cyrus gave them permission to build only a base of Mikdash. That's it. He had no interest in creating a state of Israel. This is not the Balfour Declaration. He had no interest in having a place for the Jews. All he wanted was a temple because he had through his Nevi'im and seers that God had helped him win the war and that he dedicated it to the temple. Now, it was not unique what he did. Cyrus supported all temples. He was multifaceted. Like my wife tells the story of in Shanghai, in the Mary Yeshiva. There were 300 boys, not even young men, but there were 300 men in the yeshiva camp in Mir, and they found this base of Medrash that seated 300 people.
How many?
300,
Yeah.
almost exactly. And they used it. Now, why was this place empty? It was built by a woman in honor of her husband who died, and she built a church, a mosque, and a shul.
Church, I mean, the shul.
And a shul.
And
She
what
built
was-
a shul, but no one would daven in the shul. Because of who built it. The yeshiva found this place and they sat there and learned. They took over it.
Build a church, a mosque, and a shul in the same place?
No,
or
in
places?
Hong
Three different
Kong.
places.
Yeah, Hong Kong, right? Shanghai.
No,
Shanghai.
Shanghai.
Gotta get the city right.
It was a Buddhist temple.
Oh, I forgot the Buddhist temple.
No, mosque.
No mosque? Okay.
But China does have mosques. They have.
Yeah, but again, but at that time,
That time.
we're talking about 1945, late 1930s, she built it. She didn't necessarily build. There may not have been any Muslims in Shanghai at the time. Again, I don't know. I only get story second. My wife, she didn't see it. We didn't go to look.
I've been there.
So, but they're not there. You can see, so to speak, the shul.
Jewish family,
What?
that famous Jewish family in Funny. They were,
Kaduri? Was it
Yeah.
Kaduri?
Right.
That's so.
Yeah.
Kaduri, yeah.
Okay. So how many groups? So when I read this, I just hear a list of complaints. It takes, not that I should have noticed it before, but as I mentioned last time, Dov Zakheim fills in and gives a much more fuller description of what's going on. So, of course, at first glance, I didn't notice it, I should have. How many groups of people are complaining?
Looks like everybody.
But yeah, but specifically, I'm looking for a number between 2 and 4. No, 2 and 4. 3. There are 3 groups who are complaining.
I didn't know.
How do I know that? Anyone want to tell me how I know it?
Protect common folk wives and
Does the
others.
text, the Hebrew text mention?
Well, no, it says some said, that's verse 2.
Josephus.
Verse 3 is others said. Verse 4, yet others said.
Josephus.
Right? So it's there. And all the Mephoshim notice it, that they're different groups. But then the question is, what are these different groups? What do they represent? The first group is speaking about what do they need? They need something into the future. That's their focus. Our sons and daughters are numerous. We must get grain to eat in order that we may live. Simple statement, they don't have enough food. Doesn't say anything about what happened to them up to this point. The second group says, in order to plan for it, we must pawn our fields, our vineyard. So the first group probably had no, as Zakai mentioned, the first, and I have it written up in the next page, so we'll go over it. But the first group had no property. They just talking about we need food for our children. We can't provide food for them. The second one says we pawn our fields. They have property, and they think they have an option, but they have to go into debt. They have to pawn everything they have. The third group is already past that stage. We have borrowed money against our fields and vineyards. So we've already mortgaged everything I have. I have nothing for the future. So there's three different groups speaking out and asking Nechamia. Well, first of all, they're just complaining to the people. They're not talking to Nechamia. Okay? And in fact, Nechamia hears this, and we'll see how he responds. And they use pretty graphic knowledge. You want to read? Can you read verse 5? Okay. It's too small. No.
Oh, 5, now,
Okay, we are as good as our brothers.
our flesh is as good as the flesh. We are as good as.
Yeah, so they're using a very strong language and saying our flesh is as good as their flesh. That's not, as was pointed out earlier before. I get this insights for class I have to use that it's a pretty strong terminology that you would never see typically someone saying. Now again, remember this is Nechamia. I'm doing my Rabbi Liebtag. How many of you know who Rabbi Liebtag is?
Yes, I listen to his classes every Sunday.
Okay, so Rabbi Liebtag, when he teaches anything in gracious, he says, our avos were not carrying around the diary, writing down whatever happened every day. It's not a diary. God decided how he wanted to present the stories. I mean, the facts are there, but which stories and which facts and how should be presented, that's the decision of Hashem, how to write it. So there is no narrative book that they could look up. Similarly here, Nechamia is articulating how a powerful message, and we'll see in a few minutes who is this message for. So we're as good as our brothers, our children as good as theirs. You know, often in many societies, and America is not different from it, the difference between the upper class and the lower class, the upper class thinks they're smarter, right? Because they have more money. If they're really smart, they pick the right parents. And they inherited it. But there's not necessarily much correlation. Again, if you want to talk about Musk, yes, his brains made him the world's wealthiest person in the world, but not most of the other people who become wealthy. Because if brains worked, I should have been wealthier than I am now. I have a very high IQ. I tested for it. Okay. Yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. In principle, he said, yet some of our daughters have already been subjected. Yesh mivnoseno nich Chelst. Why do you think he's emphasizing that? He talks about our sons and daughters have been subjected. Then he adds another statement, and our daughters are already subjected. What is he hinting at?
They
That
were
was false.
sold into slavery or.
Okay, they're all, okay. Remember, Jews can be sold into slavery by themselves. That's generally how it happened in throughout Tanakh. Oh, I shouldn't say that throughout Tanakh. We don't see that much later. And it's a general concept, and it exists it's better than debtor's prison. A person who can't afford to pay his debts, he looks for somebody who will take him on as a house or field slave.
For 7 years.
No, that's the maximum.
I'm
That's the
saying
maximum.
maximum for 7
But again, it could be whatever number of years he needs to pay off the debt. And he has rights and privileges that a slave would. But one of the most important things that happens is the owner has to provide for him and his family. So he had a way to feed his family. Because in certain periods of time, if you had, there were not jobs everywhere. The starting point is you own the field. If you don't own the field, there weren't many other ways to earn other than working somebody else's field. I mean, yes, there were artisans, but those were very limited array. But when he uses the phrase, the daughters are already subjective, it's hinting at what it means when an owner has a teenage woman slave in his house. What might happen to such a woman, in contrast to a boy or a man. To conquer, okay? And he repeats it. Right? אנחנו כושר מספננו וספננו לבנו, ויש מבנותינו נכבשות. ואין לאל ידינו וסוסנו כרמנו לכם. We don't have anything we can do to help it. So they're pretty strong. They're arguing that their friends are doing as such. So on the second page, in English, I took the liberty of copying something from Zakai. That's why I don't normally speak too long. Okay,
Second page.
the second page, it's in English. It's at an angle. Okay, Tammy,
The protest is fell into three distinct groups. The poorest tended not to have a field of their own. They desperately needed grain to survive.
slow down.
okay,
They were finding themselves forced to sell their children into slavery, since their fields had already been mortgaged. Yet selling off family members was as much a personal as an economic disaster for these people. To this day, poorer elements of society tend to have larger families. It is the family unit that provides the ultimate security for its members. Late in life, as in early life, and children often are an essential part of the family's labor force. Not surprisingly, given their desperate straits, they threatened Nechamia that if he did not act, they would do so on their own, seizing food wherever it might be found.
okay. So there's nothing explicit that suggests that threat. They didn't say that phrase. The question is, as I said, that kind is expanding it and trying to take a verse and trying to say what was probably happening. So he's claiming they were threatened. And when they say in the first verse, our sons and daughters, we must get grain to eat in order that we may live, it's a desperate statement that they're going to get grain one way or another. So he reads into it what they were threatened. Okay, keep going.
They can blame them, they just.
I'm not blaming them.
No, I'm just saying, nobody can blame them because they just didn't have any food.
Yeah, so that's why
They were not.
we have a great play, Les Miserables, based on that narrative. He stole a loaf of bread.
That was the situation.
Was there a famine going on in Israel? Because if
No.
they had fields, why couldn't they have been growing?
Again, over time, first of all, what always happens, and it happens in other, if you're not wealthy, you struggle before the harvest comes in. You've planted it, and you're living off of whatever grew. And if you didn't have a great crop, so everybody could have been struggling who didn't have excess wealth. So, but there's no evidence that he's talking about a famine. He doesn't say anything at all about a famine.
And it wasn't Shemitah or anything like that.
Okay, the text, there's no Shemitah here. We don't even know how often they kept Shemitah.
Problem.
Yeah. So that's all he's saying. Next, second group.
The second group of protesters was slightly better off. These people at least had property against which they could borrow. They too were starving, however, and in the end were not much more fortunate than those who had no fields in the first place. The third group appealed to Nechamia in his capacity as a representative of the king. They appear to have been in a somewhat better position than those who had pawned their fields. In the end, however, they too found themselves without the means to acquire food. Having used the produce of the fields and then mortgages against the fields to pay the king's levy upon small landowners to fund local projects.
Just the last paragraph.
In all three cases, the poor looked in vain for assistance or debt relief from their wealthier brethren. In fact, however, the rich had connived through intermarriage with local elements to feather their own nests, often at the expense of their poor compatriots. They were unlikely to volunteer any meaningful assistance to fellow Jews who were starving. The poor bitterly resented the wealth of the rich, even as they were forced to struggle for survival.
So to articulate now, who was the worst in terms of taxing the Jewish people? That we know.
Who was
Who imposed the biggest tax?
the king?
Which king? The first worst was Shlomo,
Oh, and then his son.
and then his son.
And then
And what does the
his son.
story say about that? I wish I was at home when I have a really small Tanakh.
But Lama also takes the people.
Then his son.
Yeah, but okay, so this is what the people thought. As soon as his son Rehoboam takes over, the people sent for him and summoned him. Rehoboam came. Your father made our yoke of taxation difficult. Now you will alleviate your father's difficult workload and his heavy yoke that he placed upon us, and we will serve you. So that's, they asked him. This is a direct plea to Rehoboam. And he tells him, go away for 3 days. I need to think about it. Okay, so he goes and speaks to the elders. And he asks them, what word to respond to the people? The elders say, if today you become a servant of his people and serve them and respond to them and speak kind words, they will be your servants for all days. That's what the elders recommend. In modern terminology of management, one class of what many people consider the best class, one class of leader is called a servant leader. That's a term in modern management. And that means a person who places priority in helping the people under him to get the job done. Okay, but that didn't happen. But he ignored the advice of his elders, and he took counsel from the youth, the people who were his friends, who had grown up with him, who had ministered before him. He said to them, what do you advise? Young men said, this is what you say to these people. who have spoken to you, saying, your father made a heavy yoke, you will alleviate it for us. This is what you should say to them. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. So now my father saddled you with a heavy yoke. I shall add to your yoke. My father chastised you with sticks. I will chastise you with scorpions. That was his response. No,
Didn't go well for him.
well, the famous thing is a parent saying, you're crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. Of course, none of us know anybody who says that. Okay, so there we have an example of what one group responded. Now, again, that was still when the monarchy was in full flight. Here the Jews weren't even organized in any sense of the way. They were living in villages that they'd come back to, and there was no structure. Okay.
But again, who was the king then?
There was no, Israel no longer had a kingdom. The king at that time was Darius, the Persian king. There was no
So
king.
they were paying
They were paying regular taxes like everybody else pays.
to King Cyrus?
No, the king at that time was Darius.
But
Darius, Darius.
So he
Okay.
got all the money,
What?
he received all the taxes.
Okay, I'll tell you in a minute, yeah.
But didn't Zerubbabel from the line of David go back with Ezra?
Yes, but that was 80 years ago.
What,
He's not there.
Didn't he have an issue?
Again, from one generation to the next, things change, right?
Ezra and Nechamia was only 80 years after Shlomo, right?
No. From the time the temple was destroyed, Zerubbabel led the first Aliyah.
Right.
That first Aliyah happened about 65 years after the temple was destroyed.
Right.
And in 70 years is when Haggai and Zechariah convinced them to try to build the temple again. They started, they had to stop. So that's 70 years after the destruction of, and Zerubbabel was there for that 15 years of planning. But I'm sure he died long ago. This is Ezra, despite what Chazal gave the impression of, Ezra showed up 60 years after the Aliyah happened.
After,
The Aliyah, the immigrants had come. The image you have from Chazal is he led the return. He was there. He himself says there were 3 kings before I came. Now Chazal rewrite the history book, but he shows up 60 to 70 years later. That's Ezra. Nechamia shows up 17 years after, that we know, 15 years after Ezra. Okay, so Ezra's already been there for more than a decade. He's been teaching Torah, that was his only mission. So when the Medrash says, if Moshe hadn't been given the Torah, the person who would have been most appropriate to give the Torah through is Ezra. That's a famous statement in the Gemara. But it's not because Ezra was anywhere near remotely as great as Moshe. It was because he was as committed as any other previous person to teaching Torah to everybody. So what was the main purpose of giving the Torah? That it should be taught. And that, the strange thing, if you ask anyone who wasn't Jewish, what's the official title of Moshe? I mean, they come up, leaders and different, no one would say Rabbeinu. Right? That's an unusual name. You know, there's Cyrus the Great. There's not Moses the Great. Or even Moses, the servant of God. It's Moses, our teacher. And Ezra had that same commitment. That's the only reason he came from Babel. He came at someone's request, we don't know who, to teach. He brought 1,000 people with him, 1,500 people with him. We don't know the nature of the people brought with them, whether they're the best or the worst. And we'll see periodically how he does teach, but that was his only job. He didn't address anything else. In the book of Ezra, the only thing he addressed is that people come to him and say, there's intermarriage rampant in the countryside. Can you do something about it? And by the way, it's our leaders who are being intermarried first, which is like looking at the marriages that happen, first ones that happen, and some of the most famous, not marrying Jewish people, whether it's a Clinton daughter or a Biden son. The leaders often among the first to intermarry because they, whatever reason, sociological, beyond my PhD in math does not cover sociology very. I can barely spell the word.
But that was the main thing that he did, Ezra, that he fought against the intermarriage.
Okay, that's the main thing he tried. He was not successful.
Who is he?
Ezra.
Yeah.
Ezra specifically, now depending on how you interpret the psukim, but Ezra lists the people who said we're separating from our wives, and there's about 100. Now the question is, was that misrepresented? But we're going to see Nechamia tackles the problem again, and is more successful. Okay, so Nechamia tackled that problem. He tackles two major problems: that and Shabbos. Yes, he dealt with the issue of trading on Shabbos, business trading. Because if you imagine, what's the best market day to sell to Jews? It's not Monday at TJ Maxx where there's a discount for senior citizens. It's Shabbos. They have plenty of time on their hands. Come to the market and we'll sell you stuff. So that was what was happening in the time of Nechamia. So first he said you have to close the gates and nobody's going to be allowed in on Shabbos. Then they piled all their goods out. We'll see this hopefully sometime outside. And he issued decrees to limit the possibility of doing commerce on Shabbos. So he took, now Ezra was part of the effort, and Ezra is most famous for reading the Torah in public. That's where we got the tradition of Mondays and Thursdays and reading part of the Torah. So this is Nechamia. Let's see how Nechamia speaks. You ready? Going to take up the challenge? Second paragraph on your first page.
Tell me where they did, you know,
Oh, yeah, well, they were doing this paragraph. Chapter 5. That's all we're doing today. Yes. Okay, and the paragraphs I've printed out are the entire chapter, broken up into concepts.
Tell me where you are in chapter 5.
Yeah, verse 6.
6.
Okay. Read it. Go ahead.
Me? Here, she,
No. My marriage isn't that strong. I can't ask her a second time.
no.
Wow.
You want to read?
The family's reaction and action on your.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's reading the title of it. We're on the bottom of first page.
Oh,
It angered me very much to hear their outcry in these complaints. After pondering the matter carefully, I censured the nobles and the prefect, saying, "Are you pressing claims on loans made to your brothers?" Then I raised a large crowd against them and said to them, "We have done our best to buy back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Will you now sell your brothers so they must be sold back to us?" They kept silent, for they found nothing to answer.
Okay, so this is his response. That he expresses his anger. And how does he respond? He says he ponders it carefully. And the first thing he does, he censures the leadership and directly addresses them. Doesn't seem like it had any impact. That's the way Zakheim reads it. Because what does Nechamia do next?
Got a demonstration.
You got a demonstration going. You got the people who have boards that come. I need you to express your anger as a group to these people. The first demonstration. Unusual action. Nowhere else does it ever appear, at least in Tanakh. I can't speak of nobody, but the idea that he personally, then I raised a large crowd against him. There's no doubt what he was trying to do. Somewhat frightening them. So the first time he got no response from this when he rebuked them. And then he says, he gives them slight history that may relate to themselves as well. One of the unfortunate charities that Jews have had to live with for 3,500 years is redeeming captives. Right? Pidyon Shvuyim. Because in the old days, there was nothing much you could do. You conquer a world, a country. How do you maintain? If you don't have an army to sit there and control them, the best way is to take captives. And it's not just the captives you're taking, it's all their relatives who you have their children. So that was what was typically done. And Jews happened throughout history. And we have Pidyon Shvuyim. And the Gemara already talks about Pidyon Shvuyim. And there's some interesting things in the Gemara that you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to help the captives escape. Because they're afraid that if you help one captive escape, the ones that are left behind will be treated worse. The other thing that they say is you cannot overpay for the captives. Because if you overpay an outlandish sum, this gives them an incentive to take more people. Which is exactly what happens in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, the idea that 1,000 people were returned terrorists for one person, it's mind-boggling. We've been taken captive. And-
You just said terrorists, the people who
No,
tell
he's comparing it
Yeah,
to what's
he had,
happening now.
Israel had 1,000 prisoners who were terrorists.
Oh, no.
They released 1,000 of them, including the one who became the head of Hamas, in exchange for that one captive Israeli who's been taken captive.
Well, they want them to do it the same thing now.
Okay, so this time they become a little bit better. It was only like 3-1 or 4-1 in the first release. Okay, and then what's stranger is that we will give in captives even to recover dead bodies. Now, interestingly, there are a number of parents of soldiers who died and whose bodies were taken and have said, not all of them, but a number, do not trade my son's body for terrorists. I don't want you doing anything like that.
Was that Paris, the one that, his son was killed, Poland,
Yeah, Poland's son was killed much later. You know,
no,
it's just,
no. Rabbi, from Israel, he's from South Africa originally. Ronan,
okay, I don't know who,
his son was
Paris.
killed
Your own parents.
but he was taken to
right, the body,
Gaza,
right.
and they, I think he was the one that said he doesn't want.
Okay, so there were several people, but you know,
Yeah.
because that was their concern. I mean,
The mixed rocket.
right, okay. And one of the things he's saying, and it's hinted at, which again Zakheim says, we have done our best to buy back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. In saying that, some of the people who are wealthy would have been in that category. They may have been sold in a previous generation, and I redeemed you or your children or somebody like that. So you understand what it's like in cases to be sold into slavery and how much money it cost us. What are you going to do now? You're going to take Jews as slaves and we're going to have to buy them back? That's absurd. You benefited from that. You're going to make us buy our own slaves back, our own people back? And what was their response? They kept silent, but they found nothing to answer. They don't respond, they just have to take it. Now in the next verse, which is the next verse, is verse 9.
Well,
Okay, what I wanted to show you on page 3 is here, Nechamia, what does he do? He says, let me think about it. Take count, and then he does. I wanted to show you how Ezra responded to something. Ezra is informed. He doesn't know about it, but the people of Israel come to him and say, the officers approached me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and Levites is on top of 3, whose abhorrent practice of like those. Okay, so they have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land. They have taken their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and he goes on. When I heard this is how Ezra responded. When I heard this, I rent my garment and robe. I tore hair out of my head and beard, and I sat desolate. Around me gathered all who were concerned over the words of the God of Israel because of their turning exiles trespass, while I sat desolate until the evening offering. So that kind of contrasts how Ezra responded to this crisis. Basically, he went into mourning. Nechamia doesn't take any time to mourn what they did. He immediately addresses the problem right away. He doesn't sit and say, what should I do? What can I do? He simply says, because remember, he's building a wall right now. As I've mentioned before, we'll see he builds a wall in 52 days. He doesn't have time to have a whole discussion about what are we going to do with the problem. Let's have a congressional committee to investigate it and see who's at fault. He takes action. Ezra routinely responds to the problems he faces. From a religious perspective, he mourns. Nechamia is not that type of person. So in case Nechamia didn't get the message to them across, now on the bottom of page 3, from Nechamia 5:9 through 13. What?
I'm happy to,
You're happy that the man next to you let you?
not often.
Okay, that's why you're using this opportunity. No, okay. Go ahead.
So I continue. What you are doing is not right. You ought to act in a God-fearing way so as not to give our enemies, the nations, room to reproach us.
So what is he? First of all, he's making it absolutely clear there's no excuse. Doesn't beat around the bush. He says, what you're doing, lo tova davar asher atem osim. It's not. And then what is his first concern he raises?
My brothers.
No, before that. Well, you should consider, what must the other people be looking at the Jewish people and saying, you're selling your brothers because they're so poor? I mean, so it's more of a statement that the non-Jews will say about the Jewish people. They come into the land, they immediately create two classes, and one class is selling their children. And we have a Torah that says you're allowed to do this, but you shouldn't do it in general. Okay, then it goes on.
My brothers and my servants also have claims of money and grain against them. Let us now abandon those claims.
So what is?
So he's saying he should lead by example.
Yeah, he's going to lead by example. And he includes himself in having done it. Now, it's a little hard to understand what he's referring to, because it must have been that he owned property in Israel long before, because he's only been there a week or 2 weeks. But he's saying, we've taken advantage of, people under my supervision have taken advantage of the system. And without hesitation, we're going to now abandon these claims.
But you said they own money, but they were all in Brazil, so how could they own money and account land in Israel?
Okay.
Some people
Okay,
have
let's
come
look.
70 years.
How many have members in in your families who bought land in Israel 50 years before any of your family members went there?
Something like that. But if you,
My
are you
friend-
saying that many Jews in Brazil had owned?
They may have. I mean, again, remember the people came with
This is
left their families behind. They probably had to get money from Babel, just like the first people who made Aliyah. They had no money, right? So therefore they were given loans. They also had family who they may have been, Zach, I want to say that that Nechamia clearly maintained contact with his family in Israel, because he said in his plea to the king, the reason why I need to go back is I need to look after the graves of my ancestors. That's one of the excuses he said, and I need to look after the families. So yes, I mean, the joke about the land of Israel that belongs to Palestinians, who owned the land of Israel before the so-called Palestinians?
We owned.
No, immediately before. The Turkish government.
Turkish government, yeah.
These people didn't own anything they owned. And that's one of the surprises that you maybe find out. is that when you buy land in Israel, at least in the good old days, you bought it for 99 years. You didn't actually
Yeah.
buy it to own it.
Right.
Now, that was good in 48. 99 years is not that far ahead.
But how many people in the
But
village
I think they
had
canceled it.
bought land in Israel before?
Again, I don't know.
Well, okay, but this wasn't the norm.
Why wasn't it?
I don't know what the norm is. All I know, thank God, the land never became overpopulated by anybody. So even whatever people were living there, there's still plenty of property to buy. And we don't know. But Bavel was a powerhouse both militarily and economically. And what happens when you have a powerhouse government that's strong economically? What happens to some Jews?
They do well.
They do well. Nechamia was the Secretary of State. for Bavel. That's not the title he's called. He's called the cupbearer. The one who gave wine to drink to the king, which meant he had to be the most trusted person. But not the easiest way to kill somebody in those days and leave no trace is poisoning, including wives. So Nechamia was from the upper elite. We know Daniel, who might have overlapped with Nechamia. Daniel was also a high-ranking official in the government. And we know one of the strange things that Yirmiyahu did that God told him to do. God told Yirmiyahu, buy a piece of property in a particular city to prove that you believe there's going to be a future for the state of Israel. An act of faith. Why am I buying property? We're about to go into exile. You want me to buy a piece of property? And he bought a piece of property in the land near the Kohanim. So that was a way to keep contact with the land of Israel. Okay, let's finish this paragraph. Give back
at once their fields, their vineyards, their olive trees, and their homes, and abandon the claims for the 100 pieces of silver, the grain, the wine, and the oil that you have been pressing against them. They replied, we shall give them back and not demand anything of them. We shall do just as you say. Summoning the priests, I put them under oath. Keep this promise.
So it wasn't enough they said it. He wanted them to promise. We'll see why in a minute.
I also shook out the bosom of my garment and said, so may God shake free of his household and property any man who fails to keep this promise, and may he be thus shaken and stripped. All the assembled answered, Amen, and praise the Lord.
Okay, so the people kept their promise. So there's a tradition, even into the time of the Gemara, that people who were dealt with public funds had to go out of the way to prove they weren't pocketing it. In some cases, they had to wear garments that didn't have pockets. And when I did research on it, the first thing that came up is why don't women have pockets in most of what they've been wearing? Because I just a search, and they explained it that the people who were in charge who thought they could sell pocketbooks, they thought it was a great idea that if there were no pockets, women would be buying pocketbooks.
That's called pocketbooks.
And some of the most expensive garments or accessories that women have could be a pocketbook. Unless you're on the Lower East Side and buying it off the street. So why is this unusual? So we'll finish up with the next page and I'll read it on the last page. Yirmiyahu, page 4. That everyone should set, this is what Yirmiyahu was saying at the time there was a siege on the city of Jerusalem. Everyone should set free the Hebrew slaves, both male and female, and that no one should keep their fellow Judean enslaved. Everyone, officials and people who had entered into the covenant agreed to set their male and female slaves free and not keep them enslaved any longer. Sounds good. They complied and let them go. But afterwards, they turned about and brought them back men and women that they had set free and force them back into slavery.
That's not the one.
That's why he insisted they have to swear that they're going to keep this promise, that the people in Nehemiah's time, the Kohanim forced them to take an oath. And people cared about oaths in those days.
They will not have any more slaves.
Yeah, they would not take these people back. They would not do what the people in the time were doing.
That was the oath.
That they'll keep their word and they'll never go back on it. Yeah, you can say, I kept my word, I let them free. You didn't say I wasn't going to take them back.
So they had to walk the land themselves.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or they can hire people. Okay, I mean, I wrote a major book about African-American history and slavery. So when these slaves were set free in 1863, 1864, and 1865, and then after the Civil War, what opportunities did blacks have to work? They owned no land. So what happened is they went back to work for the slave owners. And there were laws were being passed that said, if on January 1st, you don't have a job, you have the right to sell you to some slave, a field to work for that person. We'll give you your job. They had to pass special rules to prevent that from happening. Because when you free up people and they have nothing, the only place they can go back to is work the fields. So here, they probably worked the fields, but they were paid for it and all the debts were canceled. And as you said, Nechamia led by example. Okay. Then the next section we won't get to today. Last time people were coming in and I was interrupted. The next section is a very different, if you get a chance to read it, because this is not actually said at this time. This is something that Kenneth said 20 years later, but he put it in here. He says he never took a salary. Not only he didn't take it, nor his assistants take it. And he must have been a very wealthy person, which is not surprising if you're Secretary of State. And he supported all the people around him with his own money. And he was making a statement that he didn't benefit at all from being the leader.
Language is so strange. In the Hebrew, Gamba Yomashon Sibawa Pecham, and in the English it means a governor.
Right.
You never have this word in the Bible.
Well, Pecham is the word from Babylonian, because that was the official, that's the word for the title of a governor of a province in Babylonian time.
Is a Babylonian word?
No, Aramaic, Babylonian, but yeah, but that was a standard phrase. I don't know if it appears. So the most important book I ever owned, I still own, despite the fact that there's Safaria now. A friend of mine before he was going on Aliyah, only, when was that, like 40, 50 years ago? He left me his concordance, which was falling apart. So the concordance became my most important book. So I can immediately look up when I get home, where does the word Pecham exist? And I'll point out, that's how I know that that's the word chord does not mean a whole, but we came up last week. Chord means,
Many strange words that that's on the.
okay, but this is,
It would be a-
no, again, this is Nechamia style. Remember, the writer of the books used their own language to write the book. So this is Nechamia writing in his own language. That's true of all Nevi'im. When it says, and God said the following, doesn't mean God actually said it. Those words, it just means that's how the Navi recorded the because God didn't, by the way, I mean, this again, Leitag says, the Nevi'im would not tranquil, what's it? Tranquilize it? Okay, with the dummy. One who speaks to the dummy.
Ventriloquist.
Right. So you read it and it says, you know, Yeshayahu said this in the name of God. Doesn't mean God gave him those words. And all he is his mouth speaking out what God told him exactly saying. This is not Chumash. They all wrote in their own. I understand. So we're going to try and.
This many words you don't appear anywhere else in the Bible. That's.
I will check. So Hor I found multiple places in the Bible, a description of of leadership. And now the next group is coming in. Okay. Great. You're not the only one. Just think of what we now have. Bring something on your computer.
And I think I have another class. They'll be home in an hour.
Which one?
Oh, yeah. I don't. I'll have to
Okay.
check. So.
So you can read that?
Because the plan. So then,
Okay. I don't have a braille print.
something is we fix.
I have them, obviously.
Something they touch something. Very interesting. Okay, and also. So when I close the cup.
You're doing yoga.
Lock the car.
I just, let's stop. Studying that when Erica Brown was teaching. I noticed. she
Mirrors
wrote
don't go
everything.
in.
And it's in, yeah, and it's in the same series called Magid. Magid doesn't write commentaries.
Yeah,
Sense, I
the
think.
things.
They typically write an overview.
And then now I can't
Reading
find
between
my
the lines.
channel.
Yeah. And they flesh it out in the way that they do. And so I'm looking forward to